to choose a false self is to damn oneself. The only choice that can save is to choose the real self. And what we see, both in these works, in The Great Divorce and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is that the self, when it discovers itself, in reality, discovers itself guilty. Edmund, his choice of himself is to repent. And every one of the ghosts, that's the common theme in the story, that they must recognize that they've been wrong. And that once they recognize they've been wrong, they repent. Kierkegaard says the choice of self is fundamentally a kind of repentance. It's interesting because people tend to underestimate the ethical demand or the demand of Tao or the demand of good or reality and overestimate their own capacity to be able to meet it.
Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. New Year's Eve, Derek here, ready to celebrate and party loud and hard all the way to like 10:15 p.m. So if you're like me, I hope you nestle in and ring in the new year with a good book and a warm fire. Or if you like to have more fun than someone like me, get out there and indulge the celebration. Just be responsible as you do. That's all. Just a little tip from me to you. Now, we return this week to our series on the Great Divorce, and my guest this week is Stephen Dunning. He received his PhD in literature from the University of Cambridge, which he attended as a Commonwealth scholar. He's a very bright fellow. For many years, he was an English instructor at Douglas College in New Westminster, British Columbia. In 2007, he joined the English faculty of Trinity Western University up in Canada. Up for me, some people might live north of Canada. Probably not too many, but there might be a handful of you way up there in the Arctic Circle looking down at us. Enjoy the darkness this time of year. Anyway, back to Stephen. He retired from Trinity Western in 2017. He is the author of The Crisis and the Quest, a Kierkegaardian reading of Charles Williams, and of many articles on modern British and Canadian literature. He co-founded the Inklings Institute of Canada in 2013 with his colleague Monika Hilder. Along with his continued participation in Inklings Institute events, he keeps busy by writing stories for his grandchildren and their friends and by singing in a choral group. Stephen also is a writer of fiction, and his new series, The Perilous Times Saga, will be released in the first half of 2025 with book one entitled Susie and the Magic Turnip. I kick off this episode by asking Stephen to give an overview of The Great Divorce and the purposes behind it and the themes within it. I hope you'll enjoy this episode, which I've entitled Hide No More. Kierkegaard visits with Lewis in The Great Divorce. Thank you for joining me this week on The Plunge, and thank you to Stephen Dunning for being willing to take the plunge.
Yeah, hi. The first thing I'd like to say about The Great Divorce, and it just so happens I have my first edition right here. Wow.
Wow. Impressive.
It is. It's the dust cover's falling apart, but anyway, that it was written in 1944, 1945, which was at the height of Charles Williams' influence on C.S. Lewis. You may know that Charles Williams worked for the Oxford University Press when the war started and they were bombing London. They moved the Oxford Press from London to Oxford. So Williams had a lot of time to spend with Lewis, and he could regularly join the Inklings meetings and so forth. A lot of people note that they see Williams' influence in works like That Hideous Strength. But I should mention, too, that I did my PhD on Charles Williams and Kierkegaard. I'll try to explain the link there in a minute. But anyway, I see a tremendous amount of influence from Williams in this work, in two areas particularly. And the first was actually Soren Kierkegaard, because Williams was the editor at the Oxford University Press who handled the first English translations in England of Kierkegaard. So he had read most of Kierkegaard. He gave one of the first lectures on Kierkegaard to the City Literary Institute. I had a chance to look at his lecture notes and I saw those things. He also claimed to his biographer that Kierkegaard really spoke to his condition. So Williams had read a tremendous amount of Kierkegaard, and there's no doubt that he talked quite a lot about it during the Inklings. So that's sort of interesting. So there's the Kierkegaard connection. And the second one is, of course, Dante. Williams lived, breathed, ate Dante. He did live Dante, and his work, The Figure of Beatrice, was significant enough in the Inklings group that Dorothy Sayers learned Italian, medieval Italian, so she could translate Dante because of Williams, because of how enthusiastic it was. So those two things. That's the first thing, that Williams was tremendously influential on Lewis around this time and on the Inklings in general. And it was right around the time of writing this work. Okay, so that's the first thing. So that's the first, and because I'm sort of one of those odd people who knows a little bit about Charles Williams and is interested in Lewis, anyway, I think I can shed some light on it. Here was my insight, and this was first of all, I wanted to start with what I think are two quotations from the book spoken by George MacDonald, the character MacDonald, that I think said it well. And here's the first one. Do not fash yourself with such questions. You cannot fully understand the relations of choice and time till you are beyond both. And ye were not brought here to study such curiosities. What concerns you is the nature of the choice itself, and that ye can watch the making. And then he has another one. Ye saw the choices a bit more clearly than you could see them on earth. The lens was clear, but it was still seen through the lens. Do not ask of a vision in a dream more than a vision in a dream can give. And I thought about that and I thought, okay, and I agree. I think this book is essentially about the nature of choice that humans are presented with. And it's fascinating that when you read the preface, what Lewis insists on is that life does present people with an either or. And he picks up exactly the language that Kierkegaard uses in his work Either Or and many others, where he talks about the necessity of the choice of self. You must choose yourself. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more. So I think the book is essentially about choice. And then I started thinking, I thought, well, how does Lewis manage this? And I think he does it primarily through Plato. And so, anyway, what he does is, and he does this too, I'm going to point out in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is interesting. But I think that we can read what's going on here in a sense as a parallel to the myth of the cave from book 7, of the Republic. And your audience may know that story. But it's basically Plato's suggestion through this myth is that we spend most of our life chained up in a cave, engaged with shadows and trying to predict what shadows are going to come next. A philosopher manages to get outside through philosophy, of course, and then runs into the real things behind the shadows that are in the cave. And at first is blinded, but eventually becomes accustomed, goes back in the cave to explain to people that they're not dealing with reality but shadows, and gets killed for his trouble.
Right.
But and of course, we're thinking, I'm sure Plato was thinking of Socrates there, as of course. But what's fascinating is that in Lewis's retelling, it isn't a movement from earth to the realm of the forms, but it's more of a move from this shadowy city, town, which could be earth in some sense, but then goes to an area which is, I think, clearly like Plato's realm of the forms. And it's interesting because what that allows Lewis to do is he can play out what I call the psychodramas against this background that makes the fundamental choices obvious in a way that it's not obvious on earth, which is exactly what George MacDonald says. Now, what's fascinating about this too is if you look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which Lewis wrote later, of course, he does something very similar in the character of Edmund. Narnia, it took me a while to figure out what was going on in Narnia, but I'll just say this very briefly. There's a line in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where the narrator says about Father Christmas. He says, "You only see pictures of him in our world, but when you see him, he is so very real and solid that there's a kind of solemnity." And it seems to me that Lewis does the same thing for the same reasons, but with a different audience. You notice that the wardrobe that the children go into has a looking glass on the door, a mirror. When Edmund goes through, the first character he encounters is Jadis, the witch, because she is, in fact, his potential form. She represents what he can become. So what he has is he has an encounter with himself or potential of himself, and his choices become extremely clear. There's no, yeah, that's what happens. And Lewis uses something like that. It's the same kind of strategy where you look at the realities writ large, so the choices become clear. Edmund isn't just a sneaky little guy. He betrays his brother and sisters. That is a terrible crime within this world. I mean, in the real world, it would be just something that wouldn't be as obvious. So Lewis does this. He does this in the Narnia stories, and he does it here as well too, I think. But this is extremely effective. Now, the next thing I wanted to say as an overview is he's using Dante as a model here. And by the way, the choice, as we'll see, is the choice that Kierkegaard suggests. One, to choose a false self is to damn oneself. Okay? The only choice that can save is to choose the real self. And what we see, both in these works, in The Great Divorce and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is that the self, when it discovers itself, in reality, discovers itself guilty. Edmund, his choice of himself is to repent. And every one of the ghosts, that's the common theme in this story, that they must recognize that they've been wrong. And that once they recognize they've been wrong, they repent. Kierkegaard says the choice of self is fundamentally a kind of repentance. It's interesting because people tend to underestimate the ethical demand or the demand of the Tao or the demand of good or reality and overestimate their own capacity to be able to meet it. So it's sort of fascinating. So that's the Kierkegaard part. The Dante part is that, and this is the thing that really struck me, was that Dante writes a poem about a pilgrim, Dante, who goes on a tour of heaven, purgatory, of hell, purgatory, and heaven, largely with a guide, a human guide who was an admired author of his. Lewis writes the story
Virgil.
about C.S. Lewis, who goes on a tour of the environs of heaven, and his guide, and it is clearly George MacDonald, and they both called each other's master in a way. And so he's following the Dante-esque, and I'd never seen that before. I'd never seen that. It just sort of hit me. Anyway, it just sort of hit me. So I do think that's the pattern. And I think, and I do see traces of Williams. And there are differences, of course, between what Williams does with it. Williams's view, for example, on romantic love and natural, what we might call human love, is subtly different, I think, than Lewis's. And I think we'll probably get to talk in some of the questions. But anyway, that's sort of the overview. I was sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, he's doing Dante.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, it's always nice when the muse arrives just in time.
Yeah,
I suppose
2:00 in the morning.
That's right. Oh my goodness. Well, and as you referenced That Hideous Strength, Narnia, and of course we're talking about The Great Divorce.
Yeah.
The first question I have is just sort of the memory that you may have of reading a book that captivated you and how beautiful that is. And is there one that sort of transcended and carried you off to another world like so many children do with the Narnia series?
Yes, there were two, and at different ages, but there were two very significant ones. The first was The Lord of the Rings. When I finished reading it, I was about 16, and I remember being so moved and not having any words to be able to describe it. I didn't have the vocabulary that I developed over years later. But I remember coming. I think I was hanging out behind the high school that was near us. And I remember coming back to our house, and my mother was in the kitchen, and I was trying to explain to my mother how moved I was by this. And I probably was yammering on. And she looked at me, and my mom she's passed on, bless her, but she was a very practical lady. She was a nurse. And she looked at me after a while and she said, "But it's not true." And I remember thinking, no, no, it's more true than this table, the kitchen table. But I didn't have the language to express it. So that was the first thing, and it really did. I mean, it moved me like in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. The second group was actually like the second experience was with Charles Williams himself, and that was when I was in my mid 20s, and I was given, you probably know the Erdman's box set edition of those. I was given those for Christmas by some friends, and I wasn't working at the time, and I read all of them over a period of about 5 or 6 days, and I could barely talk. I was so I was so stunned by these things. It's because both of them have a common quality, and it was this, that with Tolkien, I felt like I was being drawn into the real history of our world, the spiritual history, an ethos that I recognized as true. With Charles Williams, what I felt he was showing was the world that was around me that I was missing and that he was opening up. So in both cases, I felt like I was getting closer to reality rather than being removed from it. And also, I should also mention that from that gift, there was one of the novels I didn't quite like. It didn't seem to fit in with all the others. And when you read them so close together, this one just felt differently. And in fact, my whole academic path from that moment on was trying to track down why that was the case. And so, anyway, so that was a very important moment in my development intellectually too. But yeah, so yes, I've been completely blown away. Surprisingly, the Narnia stories didn't have that effect on me, although I admire them greatly and I can see and I know, how powerful they are for kids, but they didn't have that effect on me.
Yeah. Well, we're in the same camp there. What was
Interesting.
the what was the Williams book that stood out that was different?
Shadows of Ecstasy. Here was the puzzle. It was published fourth. Then I found out later that it was only picked up and published, that it was his first book, written before and published after he'd already made some success as the fourth in the series. And I went, aha. So what happened, right, between that first and that was really what I tried to pursue. And
Wow. Well, thank you. And we've scheduled actually a series on Owen Barfield for
I love
uh,
old Owen.
yeah, the start of next year's.
Yeah. I've written an article on Barfield and on Williams and on Lewis's odd relationship with the two, because I think that Barfield is no more heretical than Williams was. And yet, Lewis really, he lionized Williams. He was his big promoter. And yet, Barfield, his famous line on Barfield was that he'd read all the right books, but got the wrong thing out of every one of them. But anyway, so yes, there you go.
Yes. Well, there's no questioning, at least publicly, Lewis's confidence. Uh,
Yeah,
do you have a favorite C.S. Lewis book?
absolutely. Um, And, and when I mention this to people, half the people haven't read it. It's Till We Have Faces. And interestingly enough, Lewis considered it his best. And when I read that later, I thought, well, yeah. And it was a myth that he had worked with or that had been around him since his teenage years. It had been something he'd been fascinated by. And it's significant to me that it's not until he is in love and with Joy Davidman and he dedicates it to Joy Davidman. And I sense a real difference. There was something hauntingly poetic in that story where it talks about you're not a good enough man to do that yet because your heart has not been broken. And he's
Yeah.
writing that, and 10 years, 12 years later, his heart is broken. And he brings one of the most a grief observed is just one of the
Right.
most. You should always read that with the problem of pain. I always say, you want to read the problem of pain, read a grief observed. But anyway, so Till We Have Faces, why? And this goes back to Owen Barfield too a little bit. And I remember I told someone this a couple of weekends ago. She's a professor at Trinity, not Monika, and she was shocked to learn that the first long exchange of letters that Lewis had with Owen Barfield was really over the status of imagination. There's a book called The Great War, Owen Barfield's Great War with C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
Yeah, and it really concerns the status of imagination, whether imagination has epistemological validity. In other words, does it give us access to reality? Lewis said no, which is fascinating. And Barfield
Right.
said a big yes.
Yes.
And in fact, you know that Lewis was conscripted by Barfield's wife because soon after they got married, Barfield converted to anthroposophy, and she was horrified. And so Lewis spent all that time. But what's fascinating to me, Until We Have Faces, is that I think his position on imagination changes slightly. I sense that I sense a different quality. Like if you take the fox as being reason, certainly a kind of stoic reason character in that book, that he does seem to recognize the limits of it, and he creates this whole room for mystical experience. I mean, Arul learns in that. So anyway, I think that it suggests us a slight change. I mean, I'm not an expert
Sure.
on that novel, but I do sense a change. And also, here's Lewis the misogynist, right? He's the terrible misogynist, and his best character ever is Arul, this superb woman. And
Yeah.
anyway, so I love that book.
There's something to be said for what's the word? The erosion of former beliefs through the weathers of time, right? So,
yeah, there you go.
Well, turning to Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which is the purpose
Yeah.
for our gathering.
Yeah.
My first question on this one is driven kind of just from my own reading. I'm curious about the line at the bus stop because I think we have so much conversation for those who, get into The Great Divorce on the different scenes that happen after the bus stop. But I was really curious if you had a favorite character in line at the bus stop or on the bus ride, and if so, why?
There's two. The first one is back to Dante. You may remember in Dante, there's Paolo and Francesca, who are the two lovers who get caught in the vestibule and they're blowing around. They're not actually in hell proper. And then there's I call them the giggling, trousered, sexually ambiguous couple who are so happy with themselves and they go off giggling that they don't want to go to heaven. But it's interesting because they don't seem to have, just as Dante treats them with kid gloves, so does Lewis in a way here too. I mean, he doesn't approve of it, but I think that that's your pair. I think that he just picks that right out of Dante. And I think it's a kind of sign, it seems to be. And the other character that I really liked, I thought was portrayed with it was it was maybe a bit harsh, but it was the Marxist poet.
Yes.
This guy,
the student, right?
The student, yeah, no one appreciates him. And what it shows is that kind of, it sort of suggests that sometimes underneath what appear to be compassionate ideologies, or like, what is he driven by? The student is driven primarily, I think, by resentment and by envy and by also I think a real suspicion that he isn't as good as he thinks he is, but he finds an ideology that he can assert himself through, and he protects himself in that. And I thought it was extremely insightful. It was a little bit nasty, maybe in a way, but it was very insightful. I thought very well handled. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it revealed in rather concise text, the progression of subscribing to that ideology and its culmination. It also begs the question of me with your comment earlier that Lewis didn't think there was access to reality via the imagination.
Yeah.
But I think of that character reminds me, I don't know if you ever saw the film Meet the Robinsons, which was an animated Disney film.
No.
It's probably been 20-ish years since it came
Okay.
out, but it has a character in it who turns out to be the villain, but when they are schoolboys, the protagonist and the villain are in the same school together, and the villain's perception of his reality creates everything. And there's a just an iconic scene where he's walking down a hallway, sullen and moody and full of angst, and all the people around him are saying, "Hey, how you doing? How's your day?" And his internal narration of the scene is, "Everybody hated me," and how that became his reality, even though it wasn't the truth. Anyway, it
That's
has some
interesting.
resonance there.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Now, in the text,
Okay.
have back-to-back questions, and the first is the scene in the Great Divorce that fills you with sorrow, and
Yeah.
the follow-up would be the scene in the Great Divorce that gives you great hope.
Now, the sorrow one, I think the one I find the most moving is it's the scene where the woman who has the procession, Sarah Smith, I believe is her name,
Yes.
and she's talking to the dwarf and the tragedian. And I found that scene profoundly moving. I think it's one of the, partly because, well, it's just so insightful. And I think it also shows it's a psychodrama that shows, and it's Kierkegaardian, I think, to its heart. And it shows how the choice of a false self is to damn oneself. I think it's so well handled, but it's tragic. I mean, it really is tragic. Let me just see what I had down here.
I think that's, chapter 11. I have the text in front of me.
Hmm. Well, the way, if you think about it, what Kierkegaard says that when people start to realize that they might be accountable or that they might have to have a self to defend, they often start on a self as a project. So the self they create is a kind of aesthetic project. So they have this aesthetic projection that they'd like to have.
Mm.
Now the thing is, it tends to be one that doesn't have real flaws, and that projection, if people insist on this projection, this false self as being the self, why is it? It's to protect the little dwarf, right?
Yeah.
There's this dwarf who doesn't think he can really be loved, who has to demand love on his own terms. But it's false, this tragedian. And it's interesting that Sarah speaks only to him. She gets down. There's wonderful condescension of reality and the good to speak, and you know what it is, and he won't laugh. He won't laugh at himself. He won't let her, and her humor, her good nature, her love. And it's like this is an image of God, God who knows us. But instead, what we want to do is we want to project the tragedian. And in this case, it's so horrible because, and I don't know what drives it. It's probably paradoxical. It's probably both fear that we can't be loved and pride that we insist on being loved or treated on the basis of some false self respect, false pride that has nothing to do with us. And so we insist on, if those who insist on this unreality, on the shadow, will get it. And that's why it's tragic. And I find that very moving. And that image of how maybe the chain, it's who's holding what, who's controlling what. And then maybe this thing that becomes the size of an insect after being a kitten, and then maybe climbs up the chain, and then the false self swallows. And that's hell. That's hell. That's when it's permanent. And that's a powerful image. Powerful image. And what's fascinating about that too is they have that big discussion about pity and whether the unhappy and miserable can blackmail the good in reality. And I thought Lewis's handling of that was just, I mean, it's still uncomfortable, right? I mean, we have
Right.
trouble with that, but I think he's right. And I think he provides a perspective. Anyway, so I found that tragic. And it's
Yeah.
really tragical because part of what he thinks he can do is blackmail God or the good or reality. And I remember what does he say? I mean, I think MacDonald says, we're not going to call yellow blue just to please you, or something
Yeah.
along those lines, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah. And
yeah.
and I need to correct it. It was actually chapter 12.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, no, that is a deeply sorrowful scene.
Hmm.
How about hope?
Hope. It's the red lizard guy.
Yes.
He's. I mean, I know you're gonna talk about it later, so I'll wait and I'll talk about it later too. But that scene does. But I was going to talk about more generally what fills me with hope. Did you ever hear of the band Simply Red?
Yes.
Okay, Simply Red has a song, and in one of the lines in the song is, "Heaven is the place where nothing ever happens." Heaven is, and it becomes, and it, you know, it's interesting that we have this predilection as humans, this fascination with evil characters. You think about the Hannibal Lecters and on and on and on. Fascination with them. It is very difficult to make good characters interesting, really good characters interesting. And I think George MacDonald was one of the few writers really did it well, like really well. And and so that's part of it. But there's also this idea of change. And if you think about like I I'm friends with, I mean, acquaintance of Hans Boersma. He's a very well
Yes.
known. Okay, well Hans he thinks that one of the most important things that we can do to recover our sacramental view is to have a full-blown Platonic metaphysic. He thinks that that's what we're missing in our culture today. Now, what's fascinating is that when a lot of people think about Platonism, they think about it as being this kind of static, fixed, like place, God being impassible, blah, 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 as opposed to, and you get the theological debates between you know, the passionless Greeks and rational Greeks and the passionate Hebrews, and you get the whole debate between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible and that tension. Lewis handles this, I think, pretty well. I remember one of the things I used to try to do with my students was to get them to imagine how heaven could not be boring, right? Is there going to be any scope, for example, for creativity? I'm not talking about the form it's going to take. Will there be? Is heaven fixed? Is it? Is there any sense in which it's open ended? Or any?
Sure.
And those are pretty important questions. And I think what really gives me hope in this book is you get the sense that yeah, they're in the environs of heaven, but that all the spirits who come back, they're on a journey into heaven and into the deep mountains and deep heaven. But God is inexhaustible. And because God is inexhaustible, so is heaven. So are we. And it's that idea that it's not a fixed, static, dead thing, but it's living and endless. And the possibilities, I think actually, anyway, that fills me with hope. And I'd like to go back to tell the guy, the Simply Reds, I can't remember what his name was, the singer, but tell him, you're wrong, buddy, about this.
Yeah. He could just change one word there, right? Heaven is the place where everything happens, not.
Yeah. I was going to say too I just want to go back a bit to the reason that that scene is tragic. I mentioned one thing, it's the choice of a false self, but it's also, in a very profound sense, a misuse of the one gift that we're told that George MacDonald says in this book is makes us most like our creator, and that's our freedom. And that for Kierkegaard, and I know that Williams knew this work well, it's particularly in The Sickness Unto Death, where he explores the different forms of the demoniac. That and freedom for Kierkegaard was also the essential thing. And he says that those who are truly evil, or the ones that turn themselves into hell, use their freedom to lock themselves away from the good. They refuse the good. And he uses that example, Jesus of Nazareth, what have you to do with us, or we with you? You know, you come to torment us. And it's like, because they recognize that in God and in God coming to us, there is the offer of freedom, a freedom that doesn't have to close in on itself, but needs to open. And it's exactly, that's what this whole thing shows, is that the self has to be open. There's a beautiful self-forgetfulness in the saved people here. And he talks about that a lot. And in a sense, it's that outward looking, right? To use freedom, not to lock ourselves away, but to open ourselves up. And that's repentance too, but it's also just to be open to life. So that's
Yeah,
another thing that's tragical. But I think that once you're open to life, then it's endless.
that makes
You know,
sense. Well, I love the way that the guides, whether it be McDonald or others, are so lighthearted about the ease of just saying I was wrong
mm-hmm,
and leaving the past behind
mm-hmm.
is the answer to that.
Well, let's go back to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Remember, the first thing that Edmund does after Aslan's had to talk with him is he goes to his brother and his sisters and says, "I'm sorry, I was wrong."
Yes.
And Aslan also says, "There's no need to say anything more about it. I've had the talk." So
Yeah.
Lewis is very consistent in that.
That's
Yeah,
beautiful and the most hopeful thing of all, I suppose.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to explore one of the central themes, as it appears to me, is the fixation on earthly or insubstantial things that
Oh, yeah.
keep the ghost from fully flowering. And I'd love to read this little quote from chapter 9.
Okay.
We're told, of course, if he would have only admitted that he'd mistaken the means for the end and had a good
Mm,
laugh at himself, he could have there begun all over again like a little child and entered into joy. And that ties into just what we were just saying. But
mm-hmm.
I'm curious about that quote and whether you would provide an application or an insight for us today. And is there a particular predilection that in our Christian culture might be a symptom of mistaking the means for the end?
Oh boy. Well, there's two or three. I mean, and they're the first two are related, I suppose. Actually, they're all related. But the first one would probably be, worship leaders, worship music leaders, getting into music, and then at some point forgetting that the point isn't for you to be the greatest musician or to have the biggest crowds, and that you are actually worshiping and that you're putting yourself in the other position. I think that does happen. You can hear people who are into worship talking about how it's always a temptation. That's an obvious one. Another obvious one is one that McDonald talks to the Lewis character about. It's about people trying to prove the existence of God, and they spend all their time doing this, forgetting that they need to live before this God who has better things to do than merely exist. But I think the one, and there's a couple of things I thought about. Well, let's get it more in terms of social media. Let's say you're a Christian, you want to become a social media influencer. One of the problems with engaging in social media, and I used to talk to my grad students about this particularly because I realized that a lot of them had what I would call a third person perspective on the persona that they're creating on social media. That is, that they're not having a proper first person perspective at all. And by the way, you need a first person perspective to repent,
Yes.
to actually, but a third person. And so they're actually seeing themselves, first of all, as if someone's looking at it from the outside, as if they're viewing themselves. And I thought that was curious. So you can forget. So let's say you get into that. You can forget after a while why you like originally, maybe the impulse was to nudge the conversation towards the good. But you can lose yourself, I think, or at least you can lose sight of who you really are before God doing that. But here's the big one, because I deal with this in my family. I won't go into any more details than that, but I have a member of my family, and a couple of them actually, a cousin, who are so into eschatology, so consumed by it, and so sure that their system, and they have different systems and they're mutually, anyway, but the thing is that they're so consumed by it that they forget that the call is not to work out the system eschatologically so that they're right or so that they have special knowledge, but the call is to live before God with the knowledge that at any moment we can be called, because as Kierkegaard says, the proximity of death is a reminder that the eternal can always call us at any moment,
Mm-hmm.
and that we ought to live that way. And in fact, but instead, what happens is the person gets so caught up in being the prophet and being right that they forget the point of it all. And the point of it is to live well before God. There's a reason why God doesn't give us the date or the time, he talks about his return and so forth. But I've seen that, and I've seen it be just devastating. But again, it's any kind of activity where you get a kind of expertise and you become more interested in your own expertise than you do in the reality of your reality before God and God's reality and your place in the church. Your place is, I always like that line, we're just a bunch of bozos on the bus. At some level, you have to remember that.
Boy, that is so true. I am, like you, not immune to having relatives who are smitten with eschatology.
It just terrifies me.
Yeah, it strikes me as we all have our feet of clay, but the
Yeah.
temptation to be in the know,
Mm-hmm.
to possess
Yes.
almost a Gnostic
I
kind
was just
of,
going to say the word. That's it. It's Gnostic.
yeah.
It's the temptation of the Gnostic. Yeah, and it's frightening. And well, I have to say that someone once said of Charles Williams that at his worst, he made Christianity sound like an in-joke. And there's always that temptation of anybody who's really smart or a bit of a visionary or anything like that. There's always that temptation. And anyway, you know what Lewis used to say? He was very aware of this. He said, that I think he was thinking of his time at the Socratic Club, but he would say, that when he had just finished, say, successfully defending some Christian position, that he knew more than ever he needed to fall on his knees before God. And yeah, it was
Wow.
precisely at
That's
that.
convicting. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. This is great, Stephen. I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Thank you.
You're adding so much to it beyond the scope of the Great Divorce, but all of it underpinning and aligning with what Lewis is getting at. My next question for you has to do with the scene. For me, this is the one that is most difficult. But in chapter 11, there's a mother grieving over her dead son, Michael, and we learn that Michael has been dead 10 years and that the mother's love was not true love. It was small-minded, controlling, and he uses the word instinctual. A few pages into the scene, the mother is told she will have her son back and that, quote, everything will be yours, God himself will be yours, but not that way. Nothing can be yours by nature. And I'm just curious if you infer anything, are we to take anything from this scene regarding Lewis's position on the doctrine of original sin or total depravity? I know that's kind of a very big question to draw
Yeah.
from one little scene, but
Okay. I think I'll just read this because
okay.
I tried to what I have. I do agree that it does say something about what Lewis might describe as natural or instinctual man or humans, right? But I want to, before I answer this, I want to take us to an argument that from a book that he wrote very soon before this, which was The Abolition of Man. And in The Abolition of Man, and this has to do with a whole framework of, I think, the way Lewis approaches things. What he hated reductive materialism. That was his bête noire when it came to theology. He went after that. Actually, he didn't like mysticism much, but he didn't like that. Anyway, so in The Abolition of Man, as you may recall, he does claim that the instincts need to be governed by the mind or reason. And he talks about the belly being this instinctual reaction that humans have. So we can equate the mother's instinctual love to it's the belly. But he says it has to be ruled through the chest. What he means by that, now what does he mean by the chest? He argues that for human beings to respond properly to things, that they need to be trained to feel the correct way about things. And he calls this the chest, and we might call it a center of organized and really ordered sentiments and emotions. That requires training. He says, until the training, the mind will have no power over the instincts. First, the training, when the kid's too young to actually know the reasons why. But you train first, and then the mind later comes in and can rule the belly through this organized sentiment. So he does imply, as far as total depravity goes, he does believe that there's something in humans that is capable of being organized and trained so that we respond properly. That doesn't sound to me, and he doesn't talk about it. It is coming from the outside in some sense, because he believes the origin of the Tao, of course, is divine. But it's kind of a little bit like the Reformed idea of the common good. It's out there. It's Romans, right? It's the fact that we understand the law of God. So there seems to be something in humans that can be trained. But it's interesting that at first the instincts are impervious to any kind of thinking about it until you're trained. So it's kind of a curious position. Instinct for Lewis, and the reason why it's no good, is because it belongs to this sphere of the reductive materialism. It's just causality. And I think Lewis actually really believes that. So this woman's love, if it's at the level purely of instinct, it is being driven by forces that are not irrational, they're irrational. There's no rationality. Whereas the training that organizes the sentiments in the chest is a way of putting some kind of rational structure that later reason can show, but it's not reason. It's reason that's connected to the logos in the universe. It's reason that's connected, but that you cannot train instinct that way. Instinct comes from that's why for Lewis, this woman's instinctual love, she has to let go of it so that she can, in a way, learn what real love is through the mind, the logos, but she never had the training. So, it's kind of like what the Jesuits said, and it's a terrible thing. You can't really say that now because of the abuse in the church and stuff. But it's interesting that the Jesuits did say, give them a child. And what they meant by that is to train in terms of proper responses. And that can become the man, that training. And it's a training before a person has the capacity to understand the importance of the training or the reasons, because they're not capable of it. Comes later. And it's interesting. Plato says the same thing about philosophy. I'm sure he said, they shouldn't really be doing philosophy till they're 30. And the implication,
Right.
the implication is that there's a lot of other things that need to happen before the mind is capable. So
Yeah.
I do see it in those terms. I see that the harshness, it's because, again, for Lewis, to surrender to instinct is to surrender to that completely irrational, reductive world of, he calls it nature in the abolition of man. It's that realm it's that realm that conquers us. For Lewis, the only freedom from being determined by that is the Tao itself, the law of God, which comes from outside it. And so if you give into it, you surrender yourself in the end to another form of hell. And you can see this in that hideous strength where he works out, that. So that's what I see going on here. I don't know if that helps at all, but that is kind of what I see. But it's hard because we don't, having said that, and this is where I think Williams and Lewis really differ on love. For Lewis, all loves, what we might call natural loves, are kind of instinctual and all need to die to be resurrected in God and given back to God, right?
Okay.
For Williams, the love themselves are grounded in God and they need to be protected from falling away. They don't need to
Mm.
die. They need not to be killed by the wrong things.
Yeah. They need to be refined, as it were.
Exactly. So in Vita Nova, it's so interesting. And here's again why I know Dante's running through this thing. What is Lewis tell George MacDonald, the guide, he talks about that moment he bought Fantastes, and he talks about the way that it was
Yes.
his La Vita Nova moment. It was his seeing Beatrice, and it baptized his imagination. But Dante went farther, and Charles Williams went farther with him. He said it was the new life when he saw her. And when he used to see Beatrice, he would say, salute. It was the same word for salvation. She represented Christ to him
Mm-hmm.
immediately. And in fact, he said that when he had fallen for her, said the only thing he could have said to anybody who said anything was caritas. He was in it. He was in love. In fact, what Sarah Smith says about being in love is what Dante says about seeing Beatrice. Very different. Dante doesn't say that this love has to die. He's saying that this love is in God. So I do see a difference in those things. And I think it's again Lewis's, I think, healthy suspicion of anything that's too tied up with the self, and self-awareness. And I don't know how else to put it, but I think
Yeah.
so. So I do think, and we find it hard because there is something very, and we've understood it. I mean, you can look at all the Madonna and Child, or the Pietas, and all those statues and paintings of Mary's grief over the loss of her son, and there is something that runs through humanity in that, and you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's not. I think Lewis. I don't think he's going to convince, and he even knows he's not going to convince people, because he says they're not ready to hear this, and no, they're
Yeah.
not. So I
Yeah.
think there's a reason. I think because I'm not sure it's the whole answer for me.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how I would say it. So I think it is a harsh thing, and I think I'm more with Williams than Lewis on that. And you know what's interesting too? Lewis had never really been in love when he
Mm.
wrote this. And you look at the difference when he talks about the effect of Joy Davidman on him when he, in a grief observed, it's just tear your heart out, because he did know it was like he'd lost himself,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
No, that's so true, and
yeah,
how what a caution to us as we attempt to communicate via story, to write what we know,
yeah,
as
yeah.
they say.
But anyway, so that's all I would say is I sense those things going on. I think it really comes down to Lewis's war with instinct and war with reductive materialism. I think that's philosophically and theologically, I think, but I think he's kind of wrong
Yeah.
in a way. I mean, it can become obsessive, and Williams and any good therapist or anybody would tell you, no, you have to trust that, because your love. Here's another way that Lewis could have put it: your love, and he does put it this way in a sense, but he doesn't trust it, I think, is, that your love comes from God. Your love for your son comes from God and finds its energy in God. And
Hmm.
that you have to trust that you won't lose that was true, that your
Yeah.
love was true. And that what needs to die is the fear,
Hmm.
that you don't have to hold on to it. We don't hold on to it. God holds on to it.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
if that helps.
That helps tremendously. And I'm with you. I do think words matter. And again, you would know better than I the distinguishing between the conceptions that are presented by Lewis and Williams and others. But it strikes me that the difference between refining and destroying are
Yep.
very critical to our entire outlook regarding the nature of our fellow man.
Do you remember Sheldon Vanauken, A Severe Mercy?
I
I
remember
th-
that book, yes.
yeah, and I think it's the same thing here. Lewis makes that argument that it was really a severe mercy. It's like you became too obsessive, so God had to take him. That's hard. I don't, and it's hard.
I'm not gonna write that. I'm glad.
No,
I mean, Lewis,
no,
go for it.
he did too.
Yeah.
Oh, And I will say one more thing though about Till We Have Faces. Do you remember what the this isn't a test, but do you remember what the epigraph was for Till We Have Faces? It's from Sonnet. I think it's 151. Love, it's from Shakespeare. Love is too young to know what conscience is.
Hmm.
And even then, he knows that there's a sense in which love needs to have the ethical added to it.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Barrett Browning talked about that too in one of her poems, where she says, when we love each other, she's talking about her husband and her, we look at each other and we're facing each other. But what she recognized as a Christian was that that self-referential couples love is not enough. It needs to point out towards the world, but it can draw, it can draw on each other. And you can actually have a dialectic where you look at each other, then look at the world, then look at, you know what I mean? So
Yeah. Yeah.
but I think that that's kind of the fear maybe that Lewis had. I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah.
but I think
That's
Williams probably changed him a bit over time. Anyway,
I hope we all do.
yeah, yeah,
My next question gets back to a chapter and a scene that we talked about earlier regarding the red lizard
yeah,
and the man. And there's this
yeah.
exchange between the ghost and the spirit, which leads to the killing of the lizard. But then the ghost becomes fully human, and the red lizard becomes a mighty stallion and
Yeah.
goes off singing for joy and in harmony with creation. So I'm just curious your thoughts on this scene and
Yeah.
anything.
Well, for me, this is one of the most Kierkegaardian moments, and the reason for that, like you may be aware that Kierkegaard had the three stages, right, of existence. He had the aesthetic stage, and then above that was the ethical stage or ethical religious, and then he had the Christian stage, which was. But anyway, let's just go with aesthetics, ethics, and then religious. And this actually goes back to what the narrator, what the spirit was trying to tell the woman who lost her son, is that if you give it up, you will not have lost it. Now, what Kierkegaard said is if you have a choice between living an aesthetic life or an ethical one, he says the choice of the self is that there will be ethical choices and that it's not about what's interesting or boring, it's about what's right and what's wrong. That's the fundamental thing. But so you have to choose the ethical over the aesthetic. But once you choose the ethical, then you're actually in the higher sphere. What you discover is that you haven't lost the aesthetic, but the aesthetic's been transformed and caught up into another realm where it now serves a different purpose, but you don't lose it. So there's always a transformation of the lower sphere into the higher, in the service of the higher. And this is one of the things, this idea of ordinal loves, right? Ordinal, we're not good at that as modernists. There's this leveling and things become quantitative, but I think what's going on here is a qualitative thing. This lizard represents a kind of fixation on lower things that in a way can't satisfy the human. When you give them up, when you allow them to die, when they get caught up into the higher realm, and it's true, all these initiations are like, they are like dying and being reborn, the transitions between things. And what happens is this thing just gets caught up and gets turned into something, a servant, but so I think that's what it is. It's this, again, it's the ordinal loves, but that there's no loss of the lower. What there is there's a transformation of the lower and it gets caught up into the higher. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Stephen. I like that a lot, actually, because again, it connects to the idea of refining.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And it's interesting too. Maybe that's the whole point of Purgatorio, right? I mean,
Right.
in Dante, that there is a necessity at times of refining, letting go of the things that are impure, but there's something good there. There's
Yes.
something worth saving and transforming. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good thing to know.
Yeah. Well, just a couple more questions, believe it or not.
Hang on, it's got to say one more thing about
Yeah.
art. About art.
Please.
Okay, I should say this quickly. It's interesting that you remember the artist who goes. It's the same kind of thing. He
Yes.
goes there and he's just thinking about painting. And what his companion spirit says is, no, you have to let go of that. You just got to start seeing again. Now, I don't know if you, it's my favorite story of Tolkien's. Actually, it's my favorite story that's a kind of apologue or parable or fable that gets at the function of aesthetics in salvation. And
Hmm.
it's Leaf by Niggle.
Yes.
And you might remember that when the artist Niggle gets taken to the afterlife, he has to spend a whole lot of time doing nothing except working and learning to work, the ground. And he has
Yeah.
to sacrifice his art. In fact, his art, he has to take his painting and he has to use it to cover Niggle, like his parish's roof. So
Yes.
literally, he has to put his art and to the love of neighbor. But notice that when he gets to the afterlife, he finds his tree there, the
Hmm.
tree that he was painting and that he sensed, and he gets to work on it. And there it becomes it becomes therapeutic. It gets caught up. He has to sacrifice it, but he
Yeah.
doesn't lose it. He gets caught up and he gets refined. As an artist, he's getting refined. And as a Christian, he's getting refined. It's a beautiful, beautiful work. I think it's one of the most profound things that's ever been written on the subject. But
That's
anyway,
that's thank you. That's really really neat. And
yeah,
it's so subtle too when you think about if you do any self-reflection, which I can't help but do as you are unpacking these concepts.
yeah,
What are the areas in my life that have yet to be relinquished with the complete confidence, not like just some sort of half-hearted hope, but complete confidence that what it's truly intended to be will be so much more beyond what I think it is that I'm
absolutely.
grasping for.
Yeah, it's about the ordering of loves.
Hmm.
All problems come about through disordered loves. I mean, it's interesting in Augustine. The fall of the angels comes through disordered love. The fall has to occur through love. There's nothing else that can occur through.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Very, very interesting.
Anyway, there you go. But yes, I like that idea about confidence. That in a way, yeah, that there is a confidence that you can surrender yourself to God, trusting that God knows you and that God wants you to do what you need to do to be you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that we don't always know the best way to get there.
Right. Right. Man, this is so good. It makes me think of McDonald's line, there's one rule in heaven, I am my own, right? I mean, sorry, one rule in hell, not
That's
heaven.
right.
I am
Yeah,
my
that's
own.
right. I'd rather it's that Milton got it right. I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Good words for us to reflect on.
absolutely.
So, my last couple of questions. I'd love to ask your thoughts on the chessboard in chapter 14, which is near
Okay.
the end.
Yeah, I know it.
Lewis asks his guide, George MacDonald, which is
Hmm.
Lewis's portrayal of MacDonald, which is the true vision. And I'm curious if he's commenting on the tension between free will and sovereignty of God, which I think he is, but I'll let you tell us a little bit more about this scene.
Well, it's interesting that I think I know where the image came from. I'll just try to cite that first. In in Williams's novel, The Greater Trumps, which Lewis would have read, there is a board which corresponds to the tarot cards of figures that move. These figures represent all the forces that are going on, and they're the forces behind the things that are happening in the world. They're little
Hmm.
figures that move around. So I think that image, but now Lewis uses it for very different purposes. So I do think it comes from the Greater Trumps, probably, or something like it. What do I make of it? I'm trying to think. I'm going to talk in general. I don't think that he was trying to work out something. I don't think that there is any way conceptually to talk about sovereignty, God's sovereignty, and free will. I don't think we have very many ways. Let me just tell you why I think that it's a problem. I think the fundamental, this was a realization that just blew me away. If we think of God as just another being out there, then yeah, sovereignty, God's sovereignty, and our free will, those are not going to work too well. But what if we actually think about God as being itself and the ground of being, which means that the ground of the self, the truest self, is God. So when I choose most freely, I can only do that through God and in God. That's kind of a bit of a puzzle.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a puzzle. Lewis said it well himself when he talked, I think it was Surprised by Joy, where he said that when he became a Christian, he was dragged kicking and screaming and, blah, blah, blah. But he said that he felt as free as he ever had in his life, and he knew he could do nothing other than what he did. And I think that if we're making that choice through God and in God, how can we even pull those two apart? How can you pull apart? It's not like there's God over there and us over here. I mean, there are at times God does chasten us, and God is self-conscious. I'm not saying he's just this idea of being, but that there's something about it that the ground of the self is in God. And anyway, so that's just one thing. But anyway, here I'm going to try something that I think Kierkegaard talks about. I don't know how much Lewis knew of this or how much Williams talked to him about it, but Kierkegaard has this wonderful statement. He says, if you view heaven from the point of view of a person in time, the view is necessarily tragic. If you view time from the perspective of eternity, it's necessarily comic. Okay. And then he's got this wonderful quotation that one of my students had typed up on a mug and gave me, and it says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what's going on here. It's that we're being offered, I don't know if this helps at all, but I just think it's that what he's pointing out is that the perspective that you choose to view these things from, whether in time and as a succession of events with eternity at the backdrop, or from the point of view of eternity, like those spirits around the table looking at the things, you will get very different senses about what's going on. And I think that what he wants to tell us is that don't speculate too much about that, because the choice is before us in time. And what MacDonald tells the narrator, you're going to have to taste the bitterness of death.
Yeah.
And that choice will be before you. What it is in eternity and what it looks like from that perspective is something that in a sense, it's not fruitful. Kierkegaard, again, this is one of the most powerful sayings that I've ever heard, and it really helps me with theology, and it's this: the world may be a system for God, but it can't be for any existing individual. And all that means is, if you think you've got your head around it as an existing individual, you're wrong. It's only that. The only one who has the transcendent view of what is really going on is God.
Yeah.
And you cannot have a system that's going to tie God in. I mean, like, you don't understand it well enough. And I think
Yeah.
and because what this book doesn't tell us, like, this book is not about squaring sovereignty with the free will of God. It's about what MacDonald says is, if you have to give up sovereignty of God or freedom, says you have to give up, if that's your understanding, give up the sovereignty of God, because freedom is the more important thing, holding on to that. That's an interesting claim,
Yeah.
because that's what's close to God. And that's really, and why? Because the whole point of this book is about choice. And what the book does is it paints the choice in very stark, clear colors. And, I just have to say one more thing, because I know Kierkegaard's working on this, or he was there somewhere. For Kierkegaard, the only thing that roots out despair is, it says, the self in choosing to be itself rests transparently in its source. Transparent. And what does Lewis do? He has all these selves transparent.
Yes.
Literally, everybody
Yes.
can see through them. And there's no hiding, right?
Right. Right.
And so that's the point. And that's what this work shows us is, this is who we are. This is what we've done with ourself. These are the mistakes we've made, but that is not the end. And that,
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, so I don't know
Oh,
if that.
man. I will sometimes comment to my children, all the world's a paradox awaiting my surrender.
I love it. That's great. That's great. That's really good.
I suppose I could have just taken Lewis's word for it at the end of his preface when he says, the last thing I wish is to arouse factual curiosity about the
Exactly.
details of the afterworld.
Exactly. And I think that's right too. I don't think it's particularly healthy. And it's interesting. I think Jesus spends more time talking about hell than he does about heaven. And
Mhm.
there's probably a reason for that, in the sense that, that maybe that's we need to get a little scared, or at least to be aware of possibilities. And he doesn't want us wasting our time trying to imagine what happened, except I do want my students to think about how creativity might play a role. But anyway,
Well, my final question, Stephen, again, this has been so delightful, is why does the Great Divorce matter, and should it continue to be read in the future?
well, I've got three huge areas where I think that it's really important. I think the first reason it's really important is because it's the Platonic element in it. That's the first thing. We need, and there's a reason why why Hans Boersma would say what he says, and why Plato is a necessary corrective today. And the first thing is, Plato's vision is profoundly hierarchical, and it's hierarchical qualitatively. So all I mean by that is we've lost in the contemporary world. There's Kierkegaard calls it the instinct of leveling. We've leveled everything down, so there are really no significant qualitative differences. Our sciences are strictly quantitative, and what Plato does is he says no, there are important hierarchical differences in things, and you need to learn to love those things appropriately. So you need to recognize the differences. But so that's the first thing. And that's really Augustine too. It's bringing back this idea of the orderliness of love. Second thing Plato does that's very useful is that he reminds us that we can fall for the shadows rather than the real things. And we have a tendency to make idols. We'll spend a lot of time inside the cave looking at shadows and thinking we're really clever because we can figure out what shadow's coming next. And that we forget that there really is there really is a significance. Whether it's, I had a discussion with this with someone like the other weekend. Even with someone like Aristotle, there is still the qualitative difference that is in things, and that we don't need to look at the super. Like, in other words, for Aristotle, the real significance of things is deeper down. For Plato, it's in a sense away from it. But the point is that it means that we should look for the meaning of things, that we should recognize there's qualitative differences, that we have a tendency towards idolatry or misplaced affection, or that, this life means a lot more. That's the first thing. Just this life means a lot more than we might think it does. So that's maybe Plato's useful. Helps us break out of the straitjacket of modernity, and all this stuff. And that's good. It's good because it's a good exercise in imagination. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, Shadowland can't last. I like that too. I mean, we should read it because what we're reminded of in this is that this realm of shadows, just like the town, someday it's in motion. There's going to come a time when it will become dark, or it will become light. Morning is going to break, and night is going to fall. That this is temporary. That this arrangement of so Plato's good because he shows us that there is reality, may not be what we immediately think it is, and that we better figure it out because there will come a change at some point. So it gives a kind of urgency, I think. I think. Okay. We should also read it, I think, because I think it's insight into the nature of choice, and the choice of the self is genius. It's exactly right. That what Lewis wants us to do is to choose reality. He wants us to know who we are, to understand and see because this isn't written for this, it's written for the readers, right? It's the readers who need to see themselves, and it's to choose reality, to have that desire to choose who we really are. And if that means repentance, that's okay. Repentance is a good start. right? It's a start. And so I think that also the insight into the nature of why people refuse that choice, as Kierkegaard put it, it's either in strength or weakness. Most of the characters we see here, it's weakness, it's fear, right? But then we get a reference, and this shows that he really does, he's got a very astute psychology. What about those spirits that come all the way from the town and go into deep heaven so they can harangue the spirits, so they can tell them that they got their little, their self-enclosed, self-satisfied heaven that doesn't know about reality, and they're going to insist on bringing hell and expanding hell right into heaven. That's what Kierkegaard calls demonic defiance. And notice the beautiful insight that the narrator has. He says, sometimes one of those guys is closer to God
Yes.
than those who don't know what's going on. Kierkegaard says exactly the same things. He says, paradoxically, the most demonic of people, by a flip, become as close to God as possible. Paradoxical. If they don't flip, they're the worst devils, but they know the good and they hate it. And they hate it, but they don't necessarily have to hate it, right? But they
Right.
know
Well,
the good. That's the difference. They've actually
yeah.
recognized reality, and they want to stand as a witness against the goodness of God, the author. Here's a
Yeah.
mistake that won't be corrected. I'm in your face. And so, well, it's interesting that Lewis understood that. Very few people talk about demonic defiance like that, you know,
Right.
and it's there. I mean, and he recognized it. I mean, most of the characters are weak and they're afraid, but there's a whole kind of evil and a refusal of the self. So that's another reason to read it. It's psychologically extremely astute, and I think he paints the nature of the choice very accurately. And the third reason is dear old Charles Williams, because I think that what his reintroducing Dante to I think people, and the importance of Dante. Dante's very much behind this work as well, and and I think that, I mean, it's clear. I mean, it's absolutely clear from the references and from the basic structure that Lewis is doing that. And I think that it'd be a useful introduction to getting people to think about, you know, romantic love and Dante. There you go. So that's it. Three reasons. It's
That's
very
perfect.
counter modern.
Yeah. Well, we could probably benefit from some of that.
Yeah, I think so.
Uh, Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been fun.
I'm going to hit stop recording.
Okay,
Hang with me for just a second.
I will.
Oh, that was great. That was
Good.
great. No, thank you so much. So many thoughts. Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word simple. 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 Simple means free from guile, innocent. It also means free from vanity, a modest person. It also means lacking in intelligence, not socially or culturally sophisticated. It's free of secondary complications. Simple. As we turn into 2025, I suppose there's a part of me, as Simple asked to be the sponsor for this week's episode, there's a part of me that longs for more simplicity and hopes for the same for you. To be free of guile, to have motives that are pure and direct and honorable, to be free from vanity, to not pursue things that elevate my ego, but pursue things that humbly connect the hearts of my friends and neighbors to goodness and light. So I don't know exactly how you'll incorporate the word simple into your life this week and in the year 2025, but may I encourage you every now and again to reflect on what it means to be simple in your context and simply be simple. Thank you so much, Simple, for sponsoring the final episode of 2024 of The Plunge.